My girlfriend came home drunk from her girls' party and tried to get into bed with me, but I played her the security camera recording from her phone. Hey everyone, my name is Kevin, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a marketing manager here in Miami, and on paper, my life looks pretty good. I've been married to Lisa for 9 years now, and we have 2 beautiful kids together. From the outside looking in, everything seems to be going well for us. But that night changed everything. It was 1:47 in the morning when she finally walked through our front door. The first thing I noticed was how her hair looked too perfect for someone who had supposedly been out drinking wine with the girls all evening. Her eyes were too alert, too focused for someone who should have been tired after a long night out. She was carrying her shoes in one hand and clutching her phone tightly in the other. And there was this smile on her face that seemed just a little too relaxed, too practiced. She paused right there in the doorway like she was expecting some kind of reaction from me. It was almost as if she had rehearsed whatever story she was planning to tell me if I dared to ask where she had been or why she was so late. The thing is, she wasn't supposed to look like that after what she claimed was just another girls' night out. Lisa crossed through our living room quietly, making an effort not to wake anyone. She dropped her keys into the small decorative bowl we keep by the stairs, the same routine she had followed 1,000 times before. Then she leaned over the back of the couch where I was sitting to give me a kiss. Her lips brushed against mine with all the warmth and emotion of a receipt being handed over after a transaction. It was routine, flat, mechanical, something we had done 1,000 times before without any real feeling behind it. I didn't move from my position on the couch. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and tried to memorize her face and all the little details I had been blind to for months. Her lipstick was smudged in a way that definitely didn't come from simply sipping wine with her girlfriends. Her hair was flattened slightly at the back, like someone's hand had been resting there for an extended period of time. And there was this faint, bitter trace of cologne lingering on her skin that definitely wasn't mine. She settled down next to me on the couch and immediately started scrolling through her phone, tucking her legs under her like absolutely nothing was wrong in the world. I picked up my own phone as well, opened the voice memo app, and pressed play on a recording I had made earlier that evening. The audio began to pour out slowly at first, with nothing but static and the sound of shifting bedsheets. Then came a man's voice, deep, confident, and disturbingly familiar. And then I heard hers. Lisa's voice, breathless and more alive than I had heard it in a very long time, saying things she hadn't whispered to me in months, maybe even years. Lisa stopped moving completely. Her thumb froze over her phone screen, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her face didn't react right away. She was still processing what she was hearing. But then, there was this small crack in her composure, an almost imperceptible flicker that passed through her eyes. I saw shock, recognition, and then pure fear wash over her features in rapid succession. I paused the audio recording and watched her carefully. She blinked once, then twice, as if trying to clear her vision or wake up from a bad dream. Then her eyes narrowed as she tried to calculate what would be the safest lie to tell me in this moment. "Are you spying on me now?" she finally said, not even bothering to try to hide the venom that was dripping from her voice. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I just stared at her, watching her like a man watches the last few seconds before a dam finally breaks apart. She stood up from the couch and started pacing around the living room, muttering things to herself under her breath. I managed to catch phrases like invasion of privacy and "you're sick," along with a few other carefully chosen jabs that were specifically designed to turn the target around and make me the villain in this situation. These were old tricks that I had seen her use before. Gaslight, deflect, attack. She had a whole toolbox full of manipulation tactics, and I had witnessed every single tool being used at one point or another over the years. But this time was different from all the other times we had fought. This wasn't just about forgotten birthdays or nights out that had run too long. This was betrayal that had been recorded, time-stamped, and was now echoing through the walls of the house that I had bought, the house that I had built for her, for us, for our children. Her pacing suddenly stopped, and she turned sharply to point an accusatory finger directly at me. "It meant nothing," she declared. I couldn't help but laugh at that. She had always hated when I laughed in that particular way. She used to tell me that it scared her because it sounded hollow, like something fundamental was broken inside of me. Maybe she had been right about that. Maybe something really was broken. And maybe it had cracked the exact moment I realized that the man in that recording was Tyler, the same guy who had helped me carry our new washer into the garage just last month. The same guy who had smiled at me with his stupid, trustworthy teeth and said, "You're lucky, man. Lisa is a catch." I leaned back in my chair and looked at her like I didn't know her anymore. And the truth was, I really didn't. Not anymore. She wasn't the woman I had married all those years ago. She had become something else entirely. Something colder, hungrier, and completely unrecognizable to me. "I know about the hotel," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face immediately drained of all color, and just like that, I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. The confidence she had been trying to project completely evaporated in an instant. "You think that was the only recording?" I continued, watching as the full weight of the situation began to dawn on her. She couldn't speak because somewhere deep down, she already knew the answer to that question. She sat back down slowly, moving like someone who was taking a seat at their own funeral. I let the silence grow teeth between us, allowing it to become something sharp and dangerous that filled every corner of the room. She stayed completely silent for exactly 23 seconds. I counted every single one of them. 23 seconds of her sitting there on the very edge of the couch cushion, staring down at the floor like maybe if she blinked enough times, this entire moment would just disappear into thin air. But it didn't disappear. I was still sitting there across from her. The recording was still echoing in the corners of the room, even though I had paused it. That hotel room laughter, both hers and his, was still ringing louder than the crushing silence that had settled between us. "You went through my stuff," she finally said, breaking the silence. Not "I'm sorry." Not "please let me explain." Not even a lie that sounded remotely like regret. I didn't flinch at her accusation. "No, I followed you," I replied matter-of-factly. Her head snapped up immediately, her eyes becoming sharp and alert, like a cornered animal that had suddenly realized the hunter wasn't just bluffing about having ammunition. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees as I prepared to lay out everything I knew. 3 nights ago? Another girls' night, right? Only you weren't with Melissa, were you? I opened my phone again and tapped on a photo, then turned the screen toward her so she could see it clearly. There she was, captured as clear as glass. Lisa standing in the hotel lobby, wearing that black dress she always claimed was reserved for special occasions. Tyler was standing right next to her, positioned far too close for it to be innocent. His hand was resting on the small of her back like it belonged there, like he had every right to touch her that way. And she was smiling, really smiling, like someone who hadn't had to pretend or put on an act for an entire evening. I flipped to the next photo, then the next one. There they were at the hotel bar, looking comfortable and intimate. Then there was a shot of them by the elevator, clearly heading upstairs together. And finally, there was the image that captured Tyler brushing his hand across her hip as she slid the key card into room 312. She stared at the phone screen in complete silence, not blinking, not speaking, not even attempting to offer up some kind of explanation. Then, slowly and deliberately, the performance began. Her voice dropped an entire octave, becoming softer and more manipulative. A tone that was clearly meant to work on my emotions. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said, trying to sound vulnerable and remorseful. I let out a single laugh through my nose, a sound that contained absolutely no humor whatsoever. "You mean the part where you let him touch you while I was at home making pizza rolls for our kids?" That comment hit its mark. She visibly winced and looked away from me, wiping at the corner of her eye like she wanted me to think she was actually crying. But there weren't any real tears there. Not really. It was all just another part of the act she was desperately trying to maintain. Then came the pivot I had been expecting. The classic reversal tactic that she always used when she felt cornered. "You've been different," she said, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. "You don't talk to me anymore. You don't look at me the way you used to. I feel completely invisible in this house." There it was. The moment where she tried to turn everything back on me, to make me the villain in her story of betrayal. I stood up from the couch, and while my voice didn't get louder, it definitely cut sharper than it had before. "So your solution was to crawl into bed with Tyler?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just sat there gaping like a fish out of water. I wasn't finished. I kept going, my voice steady and controlled. "While I was coaching Noah's soccer team every Saturday morning, while I was pulling double shifts at work to pay for your mother's physical therapy, while I was canceling plans with my friends to stay home and try to connect with you because you kept saying we were drifting apart," I paced once across the room and then stopped, turning to face her directly. "I asked you twice, if something was going on between us, if there was someone else. You looked me straight in the eye both times and said, 'Don't be paranoid, Kevin. She stood up now too, but not to apologize or beg for forgiveness. She stood up to fight back, to defend herself against the truth I was laying out. And then she said the second line that I knew I would never, ever forget for the rest of my life. Well, maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. I stared at her in complete disbelief. My jaw clenched so hard that it felt like something had actually cracked in the hinge. That was it. That was the exact moment when everything inside me went completely still. It was the kind of stillness that only comes when something shatters beyond any possibility of repair. And she knew it too. She could see it written all over my face. The moment when the light went out, when the gravity in the room shifted completely. For the first time that entire night, she actually looked scared. She took just one small step backward, but that single step said absolutely everything. She knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no walking any of it back now. Even then, even after everything, she still tried to cover it up and take back what she had just said. "I didn't mean that," she muttered quickly, but the damage was already done. I didn't move a single muscle. I just looked at her and said, "Lisa, do you even hear yourself right now?" She folded her arms tightly around herself, wrapped in that blue robe she always wore after her nights out. I used to think that robe was sexy on her, but now it just looked like a costume. Something borrowed from the woman she used to be. Or maybe she had never really been that woman at all. Maybe I had just been seeing what I wanted to see all these years. "I didn't plan it," she said, her voice much quieter this time, almost a whisper. "It just happened." No, it didn't just happen," I said, shaking my head firmly. I took a step closer to her, making sure she could see the conviction in my eyes. "You chose it. You chose every single text message you sent him. You chose every time you left this house with a lie already formed in your mouth. You chose him over and over again, Lisa." Her eyes started darting around the room frantically, like she was desperately searching for some kind of way out. Maybe she was looking for some hidden door behind our bookshelf that might let her escape from this conversation without having to face any real consequences for what she had done. "I wasn't happy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you never said a word about it to me," I replied. "I tried," she protested weakly. "No, you lied," I said flatly. "There's a difference." And just like that, all the fight seemed to drain completely out of her. Her shoulders slumped forward and her hands went limp at her sides. The entire performance was over. There were no more excuses left in her arsenal, no more crocodile tears to shed, no more manipulation tactics to deploy. "What now?" she asked, her voice small and defeated. My throat tightened because the honest truth was that I didn't know what came next. I had spent 9 entire years of my life building this relationship with her. We had established routines together, developed inside jokes, created a whole world built on shared memories and experiences. And now all of it felt like someone else's movie playing in reverse, scene by scene, unraveling until the whole thing would eventually dissolve into nothing but static. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. She sat back down on the couch, moving much slower this time, more deliberately, like she was trying very hard not to provoke whatever version of me she thought she had awakened with her words and actions. But I wasn't angry anymore. I had moved beyond anger into something much colder, something that existed in a space beyond rage. "I want to see the kids," she said suddenly, and those words hit me harder than anything else that had happened that entire night. The idea that she thought she could just flip a switch like nothing had happened, like she could pretend that everything was normal, was almost more infuriating than the affair itself. "They're asleep," I said simply. She blinked in confusion. "But I'm their mother." "Exactly," I said, looking directly into her eyes. "So start acting like it." Then I walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. I reached up and pulled down a thick, heavy envelope that had been sitting there waiting for this exact moment. It was full of printed screenshots, dates, timestamps, copies of hotel receipts, and message exchanges between her and Tyler. There was even the one message where she had told him, "He's too stupid to ever figure it out." I tossed the entire envelope onto the coffee table in front of her. She didn't touch it. She didn't even look at it directly. She just stared at it like it was a bomb that might explode if she got too close. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door and headed toward the exit. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. "Out," I said without turning around. "To breathe." She stood up quickly from the couch. "You can't just leave like this." "You left first," I said, finally turning to look at her one last time. "You just kept coming back to keep up the pretense." And with that, I left her standing there completely alone in the quiet house that no longer felt like it belonged to me. The air outside was thick and humid, still holding on to all the heat from the day. I got into my car, started the engine, and just sat there for several minutes with my hands gripping the steering wheel. I wasn't moving, wasn't even really breathing properly. The garage light was still on, and through the slats in the window, I could see her pacing around inside again. She was probably rehearsing her next set of lies, probably wondering exactly how much I knew and what else I might have seen or discovered. She had always underestimated me. She thought I was too quiet, too nice, too trusting to ever catch on to what she was doing behind my back. She wasn't completely wrong about that assessment. Not before tonight, anyway. But tonight, she had woken up someone else inside me, someone I didn't even know existed. I didn't even realize where I was driving until I found myself pulling up outside Ryan's place. He's been my best friend since high school, and he's known Lisa almost as long as I have. He opened the front door half asleep, wearing a t-shirt that was inside out, and he took one look at my face before saying anything. "You all right?" he asked immediately. I handed him the envelope without saying a word. 10 minutes later, after he had gone through all the contents, he set it down on his coffee table without making a sound. His mouth was set in a hard line, and his jaw was locked tight, like he was physically chewing back his rage. "Jesus," he said finally. "How long has this been going on?" "Months," I replied. He nodded slowly at first, then faster as the full scope of the betrayal began to sink in. "And it's Tyler." I didn't bother to answer because he already knew the truth. "I never liked that guy," Ryan said with disgust. "No one did." We sat together in complete silence for a while after that. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock on his mantle, counting down time like it was leading to something none of us were ready to face. "You staying here tonight?" Ryan asked, breaking the heavy silence that had settled between us. "I don't know," I said honestly. "You should," he replied, his voice carrying both concern and protective anger. "I don't want the kids waking up without me there," I explained. The thought of Noah and Ellie getting up in the morning and not finding me in the house made my stomach twist into knots. Ryan looked at me like he wanted to say something else, something protective and probably aggressive. Maybe he was thinking about going over to Tyler's place and beating the truth out of him with his fists. But he didn't voice whatever was going through his mind. He knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't ready for the part where anger boils over into complete chaos and violence. So I went back home. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see that the lights were off in the living room. Lisa's silhouette was curled up on the couch, like she was trying to make herself appear small and vulnerable. But she didn't speak when I came through the front door. She didn't ask me where I had gone or what I had been doing. She just watched me move through the house like I was some kind of ghost floating through the remains of a life she had helped destroy with her choices. I walked past her without saying a word and headed up the stairs to check on the kids. Their faces were soft and peaceful with sleep, and they had their stuffed animals tucked securely under their arms, like tiny shields protecting them from the adult world's complications. I stood there in their doorway for a long while, just watching them breathe and listening to the quiet sounds they made in their dreams. I stood there long enough for guilt to try sneaking its way into my thoughts. Long enough for that destructive voice in my head to start whispering things like, maybe you should just forgive her for their sake. Maybe keeping the family together is more important than your pride. But then another voice cut through those thoughts much louder and clearer than the first. It was her voice, echoing in my memory. "Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." That sentence had taken up permanent residence in my bones now. It lived there like a splinter that couldn't be removed, a constant reminder of how little respect she actually had for me and for everything I had tried to build with her. I went back downstairs, and she was still sitting there in the darkness, wide awake and waiting. "Do you want to talk?" she asked quietly, her voice tentative and uncertain. I didn't answer her question because honestly, what was left to say at this point? We had already covered all the important ground. Instead of engaging with her, I walked directly into the guest room, closed the door firmly behind me, and turned the lock with a decisive click. That night, I slept alone for the first time in 9 years. The silence in that room was different from what I was used to. Sharper, more unfamiliar, almost aggressive in its completeness. There was no warm shape lying beside me, no faint trace of her perfume clinging to the sheets, no familiar breathing patterns to fall asleep to. Just the steady hum of the air conditioning unit and the occasional creak of wood settling under the weight of choices I hadn't made, but now had to carry forward into an uncertain future. I woke up before the sun had even begun to rise. The silence in that guest room was different from anything I had experienced before. Sharper, more unfamiliar, almost hostile in its completeness. There was no warm shape lying beside me in the bed, no faint perfume clinging to the sheets, no familiar breathing patterns to provide comfort. Just the steady hum of the air conditioning unit and the occasional creak of old wood settling beneath the weight of a house that no longer felt like home. For a brief moment when I first opened my eyes, I allowed myself to hope that everything had been some kind of twisted nightmare. I imagined that I would open the guest room door, walk back into our bedroom, and find Lisa curled up under the covers, mumbling half-asleep nonsense the way she used to do in the early years of our marriage. But I knew better than to believe in that kind of false hope. I sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time, my hands hanging loosely between my knees, staring at the floor like it might somehow provide me with answers to questions I wasn't even sure how to ask yet. Then I heard a soft, hesitant knock on the door. I opened it to find Lisa standing there, still wearing that blue robe, her arms crossed tightly against her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. She looked different in the morning light, less composed, more real, or maybe just completely exposed. The armor she had been wearing the night before now had visible cracks running through it. "I didn't sleep," she said quietly, as if that was supposed to mean something significant to me. I didn't respond to her confession. She shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Can we talk before the kids get up?" So we ended up sitting at the kitchen table, positioned about 2 feet apart from each other. It was the same table where we had planned countless birthday parties over the years, signed permission slips for school trips, and argued about monthly bills and household expenses. Now it had become a battleground, or maybe neutral ground, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Try the truth," I suggested flatly. She physically flinched at my words like I had struck her. "I'm not in love with him," she said, as if that was supposed to somehow make everything better. "That doesn't help anything," I replied. "I never stopped loving you," she continued, desperation creeping into her voice. I looked at her hard, studying her face for any sign of genuine remorse. You sure had a funny way of showing it. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but I didn't trust them anymore. I had seen her cry after texting Tyler goodnight. I had seen it itemized on our phone bill when I finally started paying attention to the details. Tears meant absolutely nothing to me now. "I was lonely," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I needed to feel something again." "You could have said that to me," I replied, my voice steady and controlled. "You could have screamed it at the top of your lungs if you needed to. I would have listened to every word." "I didn't think you would," she said, her eyes dropping to stare at the table. That comment made me pause for a moment because somewhere buried underneath all the betrayal and lies was that version of us. The couple where she felt unheard and I felt unneeded. We had been 2 people living in the same house but somehow missing each other completely, and neither of us had been brave enough to say it out loud. 1,000 unspoken frustrations and disappointments had been piling up in the quiet spaces between us. But she had still chosen to go to him instead of coming to me. She had still decided to let Tyler into her life, into her body, into the most intimate parts of herself that should have belonged to our marriage. She reached across the table tentatively, her fingers barely brushing against mine in what felt like a desperate attempt at physical connection. "I want to fix this," she said, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine desperation. And for just a split second, I felt the familiar tug of our shared history pulling at me. The weight of our marriage vows, the memories of better times, the enormous responsibility of having 2 children sleeping upstairs who depended on both of us. For that brief moment, I could feel myself being drawn back toward the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. But then the memory came flooding back. The envelope full of evidence, the hotel photographs, Tyler's hands on her body, her laughter echoing through my phone speakers as she said things to him that she hadn't whispered to me in what felt like forever. "I don't know if it can be fixed," I said honestly, pulling my hand away from hers. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat back in her chair, and I watched as something fundamental changed in her eyes again. It was like watching a door slam shut, like seeing her retreat back into self-preservation mode. I could practically see her already beginning to construct her own version of this story. The version where she would eventually become the victim, where I would be painted as the unreasonable husband who refused to work on the marriage. "So that's it," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You're just giving up on us?" "No," I said firmly, meeting her gaze directly. "You already gave up on us. I'm just finally facing that reality. She stood up from the table abruptly, without saying another word, and walked out of the kitchen. And for the first time in years, I didn't follow her. I didn't chase after her to try to smooth things over or fix whatever had just been broken between us. I just sat there at that kitchen table, surrounded by the silence she had left behind. By mid-morning, the kids were awake and filling the house with their usual energy. Noah burst into the kitchen like a small tornado, still half asleep and dragging his stuffed tiger behind him by one of its legs. "Dad, where's Mom?" he asked, rubbing one sleepy eye with his free hand. I froze for a moment, not sure how to answer that question. She was upstairs, no doubt scrolling through her messages and deleting whatever evidence she could still control, trying desperately to regain some sense of power before the fallout from last night finished collapsing everything around her. But to Noah, she was still just Mom, the woman who flipped pancakes on Sunday mornings, gave the best hugs when he scraped his knee, and read bedtime stories in funny voices that made him giggle. "She's getting ready," I said, forcing my voice to sound normal and casual. "Want some pancakes?" His face immediately lit up like it was Christmas morning. "With the whipped cream?" "Yeah, buddy," I said, managing to smile at his enthusiasm. "With all the works." We sat at that same kitchen table, and for 10 precious minutes, I was able to live in a version of my life that still functioned normally. There were pancakes and giggles and maple syrup fingerprints on the counter. Noah asked if we could build a blanket fort later in the living room, and I told him yes without hesitation. I didn't know if I would still be living in this house next week, but today he deserved to have normal, and I was going to give that to him no matter what it cost me emotionally. Lisa finally came downstairs sometime later, dressed like absolutely nothing had happened between us. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie with her hair tied up in a casual ponytail. She moved around the kitchen like a stranger navigating someone else's space, avoiding any eye contact with me and maintaining a careful distance from where I was sitting. I watched her pour herself a cup of coffee, heard the metallic clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug as she stirred in sugar, and noticed how she didn't ask me how I had slept or make any attempt at normal morning conversation. The quiet tension between us was thick and loaded with unspoken hostility, but thankfully, the kids couldn't see it yet. They were still chattering excitedly over each other about their favorite cartoons and debating which dinosaur would win in a hypothetical fight, and I let them continue their innocent conversations without interruption. At exactly 11:03 in the morning, Lisa pulled me aside into the hallway, away from the children's hearing. "We need to figure out what we're doing here," she said, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't help but laugh once under my breath at the irony. "That's funny. That's exactly what I said to you about 6 months ago. You just didn't hear me then." She didn't try to argue with that assessment. Instead, she looked down at the floor like she couldn't bear to make eye contact with me anymore. Then she said the words that I suppose she thought would fix everything. "I already told Tyler it's over." My jaw clenched involuntarily. "Am I supposed to thank you for that?" She stepped back like I had physically slapped her across the face. "No, I'm saying that I'm trying to fix this situation." But the truth was that there was no fixing a house that had already burned down from the inside. You might be able to salvage a frame here and there, maybe some foundation work, but the walls would always remember the fire. The damage was permanent, and no amount of cleanup could erase what had already been destroyed. I decided to tell her the complete truth about where my head was at. "I've already started seeing a lawyer." She blinked hard, like she was trying to process information that didn't make sense to her. "Are you serious right now?" "Dead serious," I replied without hesitation. Her arms immediately folded across her chest in a defensive posture. "So that's it then? You're just walking out on our family?" "No," I said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "You already walked out on our family. I'm just finally catching up to where you've been for months." I left the room after that exchange, and her voice didn't follow me down the hallway. But behind me, I could practically feel the rage boiling just under the surface of that soft exterior she was trying to maintain. It wasn't sadness I sensed from her, and it definitely wasn't regret. It was pure anger. Anger because she was losing control of me, losing control of the narrative, losing control of how she would eventually spin this story later when she played the role of the poor abandoned wife to her friends and family. And honestly, I didn't care anymore about her anger or her potential stories. Let her tell whatever version she wanted to tell. The truth would stick around long after her lies fell apart. The evidence was documented, time-stamped, and undeniable. She immediately started doing the thing she always did whenever she felt the power dynamic shifting away from her favor. She began overcorrecting in the most obvious and transparent way possible. That afternoon, our house suddenly became a stage for the most elaborate performance I had ever witnessed. Dishes were being cleaned with unnecessary vigor, laundry was folded with military precision, and the kids were being over-entertained to an almost ridiculous degree. She was suddenly everywhere at once, offering snacks nobody had asked for, initiating games that felt forced and artificial, talking to our dog like they were long-lost best friends. It was like watching someone try to recreate a wholesome family sitcom episode, complete with all the exaggerated cheerfulness and fake enthusiasm. The problem was that it was all pure performance. Not once during this entire domestic theater production did she come to me with any actual, genuine remorse. There were no real confessions, no deeper truths being revealed, no honest conversations about what had led us to this point. It was just surface-level cleanup work, like applying a fresh coat of paint over a wall that had already completely collapsed. I watched it all quietly from the sidelines, observing her desperate attempts to create an illusion of normalcy. The kids didn't notice anything was wrong, of course. To them, it was just another weekend where Mom was being extra attentive and fun. Lisa even had the audacity to suggest that we should have a family movie night like old times, complete with popcorn and everyone piled together on the couch. I told her I had other plans for the evening. Her carefully constructed smile twitched slightly at the edges when I said that, but she managed to maintain her composure in front of the children. Later that night, when the house had finally quieted down and the kids were safely tucked into their beds, I retreated to the garage. I sat there with the door cracked open just enough to let in some of the cool night air. I didn't want her anywhere near my space, not even close enough to attempt another one of her manipulative conversations. She came out to find me anyway, despite my obvious desire for solitude. "Can we at least talk like adults?" she asked, standing in the doorway between the house and the garage. I didn't answer her question, but apparently she took my silence as permission to continue. "I didn't mean to fall into this situation with Tyler," she said, launching into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "It wasn't planned or premeditated. It was weakness on my part, pure and simple. It was loneliness and yeah, maybe some resentment that had been building up over time." She paused there like she was expecting me to offer her some kind of sympathy or understanding for her weakness. I remained completely silent. She kept going with her explanation. "You don't touch me anymore, Kevin. You barely even look at me most days. It felt like you had stopped choosing me, stopped seeing me as a woman worth pursuing." I finally looked up from where I had been staring at the concrete floor. "No, Lisa. I stopped chasing someone who was already gone." That comment hit its target. She visibly flinched, and her lips parted like she wanted to say something in response, but no words came out. I wasn't finished with what I needed to say. "You think that because I didn't blow up and start screaming, because I didn't throw things or make a huge dramatic scene, that means I don't feel anything? That I just emotionally checked out of this marriage?" I stood up from where I had been sitting. "You don't understand what happened here. I was still completely invested in this relationship. I was still holding this whole thing together with both hands while you were out there rehearsing how to say his name without your voice stuttering." The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I decided to end it by telling her something that had been eating at me. "I whispered," I said quietly. She looked confused. "What?" "No, Lisa. I did," I continued, my voice steady and controlled. "The second I heard you call him baby in my house, the second I realized that the voice you were using with him, that breathy, intimate tone, that's the same voice you haven't used with me in years." Her jaw tightened visibly as my words sank in. "You think I didn't notice how you changed?" I asked, stepping closer. "The way you would get colder and more distant after your phone buzzed with his messages? The way you started showering before girls' night instead of after? You don't hide things as well as you think you do, Lisa. You just assumed I was too slow and too trusting to catch on to what you were doing." Then she finally snapped. The mask she had been trying so desperately to maintain all day completely fell away. "Fine," she said, her voice rising with anger. "You want to make me the villain in this story? Go ahead and do it. But I wasn't the only one who fell asleep at the wheel in this marriage." There it was. The rage that had been simmering just beneath the surface finally cracked through the facade she had been struggling to hold in place all day. "Yeah?" I said, standing up to face her directly. "Then tell me exactly what I did that earned you hotel nights and lies, and Tyler sneaking out of our house while I was taking our daughter to her ballet class." She opened her mouth like she was going to respond, then stopped completely. Because there was no answer to that question that would justify what she had done. There was only guilt and the suffocating weight of her choices pressing down on both of us. I walked back into the house and left her standing out there alone in the darkness of the garage, because that's exactly where lies belonged. In the dark, isolated from everything good and honest and real. The next morning, she didn't come out of the bedroom at all. Not when the kids accidentally spilled cereal all over the kitchen floor. Not when our dog threw up on the carpet in the living room. Not even when Noah knocked over the expensive lamp she had bought last fall and burst into tears because he thought he had broken Mom's favorite thing and would get in trouble. She stayed hidden behind that closed bedroom door, pretending that maybe if she hid long enough, this entire storm would somehow pass on its own without requiring her to face any real consequences. But storms don't work that way. They don't just disappear because you close your eyes and wish them away. I cleaned up every mess that morning. I took care of breakfast, got both kids dressed and ready for the day, and handled all the little emergencies that come with managing a household. But I wasn't doing it out of routine this time, or out of some sense of duty to maintain the status quo. I was doing it because I needed to remind myself what was still real in my life, what still mattered when everything else was falling apart around me. The house felt like a museum now, filled with pictures of a smiling family hanging on the walls, images that were frozen in time but lying with every single frame. I caught myself staring too long at the photograph from last Christmas, where Lisa had her arms wrapped around me and her cheek pressed affectionately against mine. But I remembered that day with perfect clarity now. She had left the house right after we finished opening presents, claiming she needed to go check on her mother who wasn't feeling well. She didn't go to her mother's house. I knew that now. By the time she finally came downstairs, it was nearly noon. Her hair was brushed neatly, and she was wearing a clean sweater like she was trying to project an image of having everything together. There was no visible trace of last night's heated argument written on her face, except for her eyes. They were swollen and red-rimmed from what I assumed had been hours of crying or sleeplessness. But despite the obvious signs of distress, she held her head high like someone who hadn't just burned down everything we had built together over the past 9 years. "Can we talk?" she asked me again, for what felt like the 100th time in the past few days. I nodded once, not because I particularly wanted to have another conversation with her, but because I needed to understand where her mind was at this point. I wanted to hear what new version of reality she was going to try to sell me this time. We sat across from each other in the sunroom, which felt like neutral territory. It was the same space where we had celebrated our wedding anniversary dinner just last year, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about our future plans like we actually had a future worth planning for. She looked around the room like she was trying to gather courage from the furniture before speaking. "I've been looking at therapists online," she said finally. "Couples therapy, or even just individual therapy for me. I think I need to understand why I let things get this far out of control." "You didn't let it get this far," I said, correcting her immediately. "You drove it this far. There's a difference." She winced at my words, but didn't try to deny the accuracy of what I had said. "I want to be better," she continued, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "For you, for the kids, for myself. I want to figure out how to be the person you fell in love with again." I should have felt something positive in that moment. Hope, maybe? Relief that she was finally taking some responsibility. But all I felt was an overwhelming sense of exhaustion that went bone deep. "Are you sorry?" I asked her directly. "I mean really sorry. Are you sorry because you hurt me and destroyed our marriage? Or are you sorry because you got caught?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again without saying anything. That hesitation was all the answer I needed. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I said honestly. And without trust, there's literally nothing left to build on. Real tears finally came then. Not the fake ones she had been trying to produce over the past few days, but genuine tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. But it was too late for that kind of emotional currency. The account was completely overdrawn, and there was no amount of crying that could restore the balance. She reached across the table with a trembling hand, trying to make some kind of physical connection with me. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine pain. I looked at her outstretched hand, then directly into her eyes, and said the only completely honest thing I had left to offer her. "I miss who you used to be." The next few days settled into what I can only describe as a quiet storm. There was no more yelling between us, no more late-night arguments and hushed voices, no desperate pleading or dramatic door slamming. Instead, we existed in a cold, calculated stillness that felt like we were two people orbiting the ruins of the same burning building while pretending not to notice the smoke that was still rising from the wreckage. We functioned like business partners who had been forced to work together despite a fundamental disagreement. We were efficient and detached, rotating childcare responsibilities and making dinner in complete silence. We handed off daily routines like employees, changing shifts at a job neither of us wanted to be doing anymore. The kids started to notice that something was fundamentally wrong. Noah asked me one night as I was tucking him into bed, "Dad, why does Mommy only smile when we're looking at her?" I didn't have a good answer for that question. I just kissed his forehead gently and told him that he didn't need to worry about grown-up problems. But inside, I knew he was already worrying. And that knowledge felt like another knife being twisted in my chest. And then Sunday arrived, bringing with it a revelation that would change everything once again. Lisa came into the living room that morning holding her phone in her hand, her expression completely unreadable. Her thumb was visibly shaking as it hovered over the screen, and she looked at me like she was trying to choose between pulling the pin on a grenade or making a final confession. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely steady. I didn't say anything in response. I just waited for whatever bomb she was about to drop. She held out her phone toward me so I could see the screen clearly. It was a screenshot of a text message conversation. From Tyler, again. The message read, "I miss your mouth. You sure he doesn't suspect anything?" The timestamp showed it was from 2 weeks before I had played that first recording for her. 2 weeks before our initial confrontation about the affair. I looked at the message, then looked back at her. She had gone pale, almost gray in color, and her breathing had become shallow and unsteady. "I didn't end it when I told you I did," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I told you that I had ended things with Tyler, but I didn't actually do it." I blinked just once. I didn't even flinch at this new revelation. There it was, the second betrayal, the one that came after all her supposed remorse and promises to do better. This was the proof that she hadn't just slipped up or made a mistake in a moment of weakness. She had made a deliberate choice to dive deeper into deception. "You lied to me again," I said, my voice completely flat and emotionless. "After everything that happened between us, after I gave you a chance to be completely honest and start over, you looked me in the eye and lied to me again." Her voice cracked as she tried to explain. "I didn't want to lose you completely. You already had lost me," I said, standing up from the couch without any hesitation. "You lost me the first time you chose him over our marriage." And then I said the words that I knew would end everything permanently. "You need to leave this house." She froze completely, like she couldn't process what I had just said. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not doing this anymore," I said firmly. "The therapy conversations, the fake attempts at rebuilding trust, the pretending that any of this can be fixed. I'm completely done with all of it." "But we have children together," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "I will never take them away from you," I replied. "But this house, this relationship, this marriage, it's over. Finished." She staggered backward like I had physically struck her across the face. And for a brief moment, I saw something in her expression that wasn't just fear or sadness. It was pure panic. But I realized it wasn't panic because she was losing me as a husband or because our marriage was ending. It was panic because she was losing control of the entire situation. Because now I was the one walking away, and she couldn't manipulate or manage that reality. "You don't get to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of desperation and rage. "You're just going to throw away everything we've built together over the past 9 years?" "You already threw it away," I said, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. "I'm just finally done standing around in the ashes pretending there's something left to save." I headed toward the front door and she followed me, her voice becoming more desperate with each step. "You can't just walk away from this family." I stopped and turned to face her one final time. "You walked away first, Lisa. You just kept coming back to maintain the illusion." I left her standing there in the doorway, and there was no yelling, no dramatic parting shots, no theatrical final scene. Just the simple, quiet sound of a door closing behind the last lie she would ever tell me. I drove around aimlessly for hours with no particular destination in mind, and no music playing. Just the steady hum of the engine, and the strange buzzing sensation in my chest that wouldn't go away. There were 1,000 different emotions clawing for space inside me. Grief, fury, disbelief, relief, exhaustion. But beneath all of that chaos, there was this unfamiliar sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in months, maybe even years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could actually breathe properly. The fog that had been clouding my judgment and my instincts had finally lifted completely. There was no more pretending, no more doubt, no more second-guessing my own perceptions. Lisa had played her final card, and it wasn't remorse or genuine regret. It was an attempt at control and manipulation. When control didn't work on me anymore, she had tried to use fear, fear of separation, fear of me walking away, fear of having to face herself in the mirror without my forgiveness to hide behind. She didn't miss me as a person. She missed the version of herself that existed in my willingness to overlook her betrayals. I ended up at the lake near where my parents used to have their old cabin. I sat on a weathered bench by the water's edge until the sun started slipping behind the trees and the sky began to change colors. I thought about the boy I had been before I met her, before marriage, before betrayal had taught me that trust could be shattered so completely. That younger version of myself would have probably hated this current version of me. So cautious, so tired, so bent under the weight of disappointment. But I think he would have been proud too, because when it really mattered, I didn't stay. I didn't accept the unacceptable just to avoid being alone. When I finally got back to the house, it was quiet in a way that felt different from the tense silences of the past few days. She was packing. I could hear her moving around upstairs, opening and closing drawers, folding clothes into boxes. I didn't go up to help her, and I didn't try to start any conversations. I just let her do what she needed to do. She walked past me several times carrying boxes and bags to her car, pausing by the front door each time, like she was hoping for some kind of final moment or dramatic closure. Maybe she wanted me to beg her to stay, or to have one last emotional conversation where we could both say poetic things about what we had meant to each other. But I gave her nothing. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. There was nothing left to say that would change anything or make any of this hurt less. She finally left without any dramatic exit or last-minute apology. There was no grand speech about what we had meant to each other, or what she wished she could have done differently. Just the sound of her car engine starting in the driveway and then pulling away, carrying her and all her belongings out of my life for good. I walked upstairs and checked on the kids one more time. They were both sleeping peacefully, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in their family structure. I sat down on the floor beside their bedroom door and finally allowed everything to hit me all at once. 9 years of my life were gone. Not lost in one dramatic moment or catastrophic event, but eroded away in 1,000 tiny cracks that she thought I would never notice. And now here I was, sitting alone in a house that felt simultaneously empty and liberated, broken but somehow more honest than it had been in months. Somewhere in all that wreckage and emotional debris, I found something that I hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness exactly, and it definitely wasn't relief. But it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild something real from the ashes of something that had been fake for far longer than I had wanted to admit. Monday morning arrived like any other day. The alarm went off at 6:30. I made toast in the kitchen, and the kids argued about who got to brush their teeth first. But this time, there was no shadow moving around in the hallway. No sudden tension filling the room when footsteps came down the stairs. Lisa was gone. Not just physically absent from the house, but the poison had been completely cut out of our daily routine. What was left behind wasn't grief, at least not the kind I had expected. It was quiet. A raw, strange kind of quiet that didn't ache with longing or regret. It was the kind of silence that actually lets you hear your own thoughts again, without interference. I dropped the kids off at school that morning and stayed sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward, watching other parents rush past my windows as they headed off to their own complicated lives. All these people were probably pretending to have everything together, just like I had been doing for months. But the difference was that I didn't have to pretend anymore. The mask had been ripped off, and what was underneath was damaged but real. By noon, I was sitting across from a lawyer. Not the expensive type with a penthouse office and gold cufflinks, just a regular guy in a tan jacket who looked at the thick folder I handed him and let out a low whistle. "You've got more than enough evidence here," he said, flipping through the pages of screenshots, receipts, and documented messages. The audio recordings, the text messages, the hotel receipts, the photographs. This is pretty comprehensive documentation. He asked me if I wanted to fight for full custody of the children. I told him no, not immediately anyway. She might have been a terrible wife, but she wasn't necessarily a bad mother. The kids needed their mom in their lives, even if I couldn't trust her to be in mine. But I made it absolutely clear that I would be protecting my children with everything I had if she tried to use them as weapons in this process. He asked if I wanted to keep the house. I said yes without hesitation, because that house was mine in every way that mattered. I had painted every wall, built the swing set in the backyard with my own hands, rewired the electrical systems, and paid every mortgage payment on time for years. I had sat up late at night in that living room while Lisa was out in parking lots texting Tyler. This wasn't just a piece of property to be divided up. It was proof. proof that I had showed up, that I had stayed faithful, that I had tried to build something lasting and meaningful. That night, I received a text message from her. It was simple and predictable. "I hope someday you'll forgive me." I stared at those words on my phone screen for a very long time. I typed out a response, then deleted it. I typed another response, then deleted that one too. Finally, I put the phone down on the counter and did something I hadn't done in years. I read a book, made myself a cup of tea, opened the windows to let in the fresh air, and listened to the wind like it actually meant something important. I wasn't healed from everything that had happened, not even close to being completely whole again, but I was healing, and that was more than I had experienced in a very long time. It was progress, and progress felt like something I could build on. I made the conscious decision not to respond to her text message. Not that night, not the next day, and not ever. Because forgiveness isn't something you hand over like a receipt after a transaction. Real forgiveness is something that has to be earned through consistent actions and genuine change over time. And Lisa had stopped earning anything from me the exact second she chose to tell another lie instead of having an honest conversation about our problems. The days began to turn into weeks, and life settled into a new rhythm that was surprisingly manageable. The kids adjusted to our new reality much faster than I had expected them to. Children are resilient in ways that adults often underestimate, and they have this amazing ability to adapt to changes that would completely devastate grown-ups. They asked me where their mother was, of course, and I gave them age-appropriate versions of the truth that were filtered through gentleness and care. "Mom needed some time to figure some things out," I would tell them. "She's staying somewhere else for a while, but she still loves both of you very much." Because no matter how much I hated what Lisa had done to our marriage, I was never going to poison my children against their mother. That kind of bitterness and resentment eats through everything it touches, and I refused to let my pain become their burden to carry. Eventually, Lisa started taking the kids on weekends. She was always punctual when she came to pick them up, always artificially polite during our brief interactions. She would smile too much during these exchanges, like she thought she could somehow audition her way back into the role of wife by proving she could still be a good mother, but she never asked to talk to me privately anymore. She never tried to initiate conversations about our relationship or attempted to negotiate some kind of reconciliation. Because somewhere deep down, she finally understood that the door was permanently closed. There was no amount of good behavior or time that could undo what she had chosen to do. I focused all my energy on rebuilding my life from the ground up. The house gradually became quieter, but it also felt infinitely lighter without her presence. I rearranged the living room furniture to create a completely different layout. I took down all the family photographs that I couldn't look at anymore without feeling that familiar knife twist in my chest, and I replaced them with new pictures of just me and the kids. There were photos of us at the park, covered in mud after building elaborate sandcastles. Pictures of Noah wearing my oversized shoes and grinning like a tiny storm had just passed through the house. Images of Ellie in her dance recital costume, beaming with pride after her first solo performance. And something amazing happened. I started laughing again. Not the bitter, hollow sound that used to escape when something hurt too much to process properly. These were real laughs, genuine expressions of joy that came from remembering who I actually was underneath all the pain and betrayal. The kind of laughter that bubbles up when your 4-year-old tells you a joke that makes absolutely no sense, but is delivered with such enthusiasm that you can't help but be delighted by their pure happiness. I began running again, something I had given up years ago when life got too busy and complicated. I started reading books that had nothing to do with work or responsibility, just stories that transported me to different worlds for a few hours. I learned how to cook meals that were more elaborate than the basic survival food I had been making for months. I even joined a community group at the local recreation center. Nothing dramatic or life-changing. Just a place where people gathered to play volleyball on Thursday nights, and maybe grab a beer afterward. Simple, normal human interactions that reminded me what it felt like to be social, without constantly worrying about what secrets were being hidden or what lies were being told. These were just small pieces of a man stitching himself back together without apology or explanation to anyone else. I wasn't trying to prove anything to Lisa or show her what she had lost. I was simply rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells or trying to decode hidden meanings in every conversation. One night, several weeks after she had moved out, I opened an old box that had been sitting in the back of our bedroom closet. Inside was a photograph of Lisa and me from the early days of our relationship, back when we still believed that everything we were building together would last forever. Both of us looked so young and hopeful in that picture, so convinced that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle that life might throw at us. I looked at that photograph for a long while, studying both of our faces and trying to remember what it had felt like to be that optimistic about our future together. And instead of the familiar surge of rage or grief or even longing that I had expected to feel, I just experienced this strange sense of distance. That version of her, that version of me, they were both gone now, disappeared into a past that felt like it belonged to completely different people. We had both made mistakes along the way, that much was undeniably true. Her mistakes were louder, crueler, and far more permanent than mine. But I wasn't entirely blameless in how our marriage had deteriorated. I had stopped showing up in some of the ways that really mattered. I had stopped hearing her complaints and concerns before she started whispering them to someone else instead. But none of that history, none of those relationship dynamics could ever justify what she had chosen to do. She didn't slip accidentally into Tyler's bed. She didn't stumble into months of deception and lies. She made a deliberate choice to jump into betrayal with both feet, and now I finally understood the difference between explanation and justification. If you're reading this story and you feel like something fundamental is wrong in your own relationship, please don't ignore those instincts. Don't wait around for audio recordings or hotel receipts or photographic evidence before you take action. Speak up about what you're feeling. Ask the hard questions that you're afraid to ask. Listen harder to the answers you receive and pay attention to the answers you don't get. And if you catch someone you love lying to you with that same tired, condescending smirk that says they think you're too stupid to figure out the truth, don't chase after them. Don't scream or beg or try to convince them to choose you over their deception. Just stand up, walk away with your dignity intact, and let the silence do all the work that words can't accomplish. Because trust, once it's been broken in the way that mine was shattered, doesn't just magically come back because someone says they're sorry. It changes you forever, rewires something fundamental in your brain about how you move through the world and how much of yourself you're willing to risk for another person. And sometimes, that change is exactly what you needed to become the person you were always supposed to be. The truth is that I'm better now than I was when I was married to someone who didn't respect me enough to be honest. I'm more careful about who I let into my inner circle, but I'm also more authentic in my relationships because I refuse to pretend everything is fine when it isn't. I've learned to trust my instincts again instead of talking myself out of what I can clearly see with my own eyes. My children are happier too, even though their family structure looks different now. They live in a house where there's no underlying tension crackling through every conversation, no hushed arguments behind closed doors, no feeling like they need to walk on eggshells to avoid setting off some invisible landmine. They have two parents who love them completely, even if those parents can't be in the same room together anymore without feeling the weight of everything that was broken between them. And that's enough? It has to be enough because it's real, and real is infinitely better than perfect-looking lies. Sometimes that fundamental change in who you are is exactly what you needed to happen, even if it came through the most painful possible circumstances. The process of rebuilding my life taught me something important about resilience that I never understood before. It's not about bouncing back to who you were before the trauma occurred. True resilience is about using the broken pieces to construct something entirely new, something that's stronger, more honest, and more aligned with who you're supposed to be. I'm not the same man who sat on that couch at 1:47 in the morning, watching his wife walk through the door with lies written all over her face. That version of me was too trusting, too willing to ignore obvious red flags, too invested in maintaining peace at the expense of truth. This new version of me knows better. He asks harder questions. He pays attention to actions instead of just listening to words. He understands that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behavior by refusing to accept the unacceptable. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in October. I sat in that courthouse conference room, signed the papers that officially ended our 9-year marriage, and felt nothing but relief. No sadness, no regret, no last-minute doubts about whether I was making the right decision. Lisa sat across the table from me during that meeting, and she looked smaller somehow. Not physically smaller, but diminished in a way that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what she had destroyed. She didn't try to make small talk or ask about getting back together. She just signed her name where the lawyer pointed and avoided making eye contact with me. When we walked out of that building, we went to separate parking lots and drove away in opposite directions. There was no final conversation, no closure speech, no moment where we acknowledged what we had once meant to each other. Just two people who had shared a life together for nearly a decade, now becoming complete strangers by choice. And that was exactly how it should have ended. I picked up the kids from school that afternoon and took them out for ice cream to celebrate absolutely nothing except the fact that we were still here, still together, still capable of finding reasons to smile on an ordinary Tuesday. Noah got chocolate chip cookie dough and managed to get more of it on his shirt than in his mouth. Ellie chose strawberry and ate it with the focused concentration of someone performing surgery. We sat at that little metal table outside the ice cream shop, and I looked at these two perfect human beings that Lisa and I had somehow managed to create together. And I felt overwhelmingly grateful. Not grateful for the pain that had brought us to this point, but grateful that we had all survived it intact and stronger. That night, after I tucked both kids into bed and read them their favorite stories, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and looked up at the stars. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional dog barking a few streets over. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt completely at peace with where my life was heading. Not because everything was perfect or because all my problems had been solved, but because everything was real, honest, built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by lies or betrayal or someone else's inability to choose integrity over momentary pleasure. I'm still healing. I probably will be for a while longer. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, and learning to be vulnerable again after being betrayed takes time and patience with yourself. But I'm no longer afraid of being alone, because I've learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I have my children, my friends, my work, my hobbies, and most importantly, I have myself back. The authentic version that isn't constantly trying to manage someone else's deception or fix someone else's character flaws. And if love finds me again someday, it will be with someone who understands that honesty isn't negotiable, that trust is sacred, and that the person who truly loves you will never make you feel like you're crazy for believing your own eyes. Until then, this is enough. We are enough. And that's a kind of happiness that no one can take away from you, because it comes from within instead of depending on someone else's choices. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that you're stronger than you ever imagined, and that you deserve so much better than you were willing to settle for.